Look at any child you know today, and look at what surrounds them. A mountain of plastic toys, a glowing screen, a whole room built to keep them entertained and safe. Now take every single piece of it away. No toys, no screens, no soft crib, no walls. Nothing between them and a frozen continent that would happily kill them before their next birthday. 15,000 years ago, the children of Ice Age America grew up with exactly none of the things we think a child needs, and roughly half of them never reached the age of 5, and yet here is the strange part that flips the whole story. Those kids were not sitting around bored and deprived. They were, quietly, some of the busiest, most closely watched, most relentlessly trained small humans who have ever lived, because, in their world, a game of chase and a lesson in survival were the exact same thing. So what was it actually like to be a child when the entire world was trying to kill you? And the answer to that question is far stranger, and far more tender, than the cold and the danger would ever make you get. To understand their childhood, you first have to understand what they were born into. Because it was nothing like a nursery. There was no hospital, no clean water on tap. No doctor waiting down the road. There was a skin tent, on a freezing plain, a small band of a few dozen people. And a mother giving birth by firelight, with only the older women of the group to help her. A newborn arrived into a world where a hard winter, a bad infection, or a single unlucky fever could end everything in days, and the numbers were brutal in a way that is hard for us to even feel. Something like 1 in 4 babies might not survive their first year, and only about half of all children would ever grow up at all. Every family carried that knowledge in their bones. And that single fact shaped everything about how these children were raised. Because when you can lose a child so easily, you hold on to the ones you have with a fierceness that is difficult to imagine from a heated room with a full fridge. So the first years of an Ice Age childhood were spent, almost literally, attached to another human being. There were no cribs to leave a baby in, and no safe corner of the floor, because there was no safe corner anywhere, so infants were carried, all day, every day, against a parent's body or bound snugly to a cradleboard that a mother could sling on her back and take anywhere. They were wrapped in the softest furs the group owned, packed with moss and dry grass that worked as both diaper and insulation, and kept within arm's reach of a fire that someone was always tending. A baby in that world was almost never put down and almost never alone, nursed for years rather than months because soft food was scarce and mother's milk was the safest thing a small body could get. To us, that sounds exhausting. To them, it was simply survival. A child that stayed warm, stayed fed, and stayed close was a child that might live, and a child set down and left was a child the cold or the dark could take. And almost as soon as they could walk, the lessons began. Because in a world this dangerous, there was no luxury of learning things slowly. The very first things a child in Ice Age America was taught were not letters or numbers. They were rules that kept you alive, drilled in early and hard. Never wander from the group, because the plain beyond the firelight belonged to lions and short-faced bears and a cold that killed. Never let the fire die, and never, ever touch it wrong. Learn the sound the adults make when they mean danger, and freeze the instant you hear it. These were not gentle suggestions whispered at bedtime, they were survival reflexes burned into a toddler by a whole band of watchful adults. Because a single mistake, one wandered-off child, one careless moment near the water, could not be undone. In our world, we protect children by removing the danger. In theirs, they protected children by teaching them, absurdly young, to respect a danger that never went away. Which finally brings us to the toys, or rather the total absence of them, and this is where the whole picture quietly turns beautiful. These children had no toys in the way we mean the word, nothing made purely for amusement, because nothing in that world was made purely for anything. But archaeologists keep finding something haunting scattered across ancient camps: tiny tools. Miniature spear points too small to hunt with. Little scrapers sized for a child's hand. Small, half-finished blades that a clumsy young thumb clearly practiced on. These were not toys in our sense, and they were not quite tools either. They were something in between, the physical proof that a child's play and a child's apprenticeship were the very same act. A little one napping a crooked little blade beside a parent was not being kept busy. They were beginning, at 3 or 4 years old, the single most important craft their entire life would ever depend on. And their games, the running and chasing and hiding that every child in every age has always done, carried a hidden second purpose that their whole survival was quietly built on. When these children chased each other across the camp, they were training the legs and lungs that would one day run down wounded game. When they threw stones at a target or a tuft of grass, they were grinding, throw by throw, the aim that would put a spear into a mammoth's side. When they crept and hid and stalked one another in the long grass, they were rehearsing the patience of the hunt. Even the little ones, toddling after their mothers, pointing at every plant and track and bird, were downloading a map of the living world, one question at a time. Nobody sat these children down for a lesson in most of this. They learned it the way children have always learned the deepest things, through play, except that here the game and the skill that kept you from starving were the same motion, practiced 10,000 times before it ever had to be real. As they grew, the playing slowly braided into something more like an apprenticeship to the entire world around them. There were no books to hold any of it, so the knowledge lived in people, and a child's real school was walking at an elder's side. From a grandmother, a girl learned which plants healed and which killed, which berry was food and which was a slow death, where the water hid in a dry season, and how to read the sky before a storm that could freeze you. From the men and the older boys, a child learned to read the ground like a page, to tell from a single print what animal had passed, how long ago, whether it was hurt. Every elder was a living library, and every child was memorizing volumes that had no other copy anywhere on earth. Lose a child, and you lost a future hunter. But lose an old one before the young had learned, for the young had listened enough, and you could lose knowledge the whole band needed to survive the next hard year. So it is fair to say that childhood, as a long protected pause before the hard work of living, did not really exist for them. A child of 5 or 6 was not a spectator. They were already useful, already contributing, hauling water, minding the babies below them, gathering firewood, watching the fire, learning to prepare a skin. By the standards of a modern kindergarten, these were children carrying a startling weight of responsibility, and carrying it as something completely normal. And yet, and this is the part that should stay with you, that does not mean they were unloved or treated as small adults, to be used. We know, from the one grave these people left us, a baby buried under a blanket of red ochre, with more than 100 of the group's most precious things, that they cherished their children with an intensity that reaches across 12,000 years and grabs you by the throat. They were not given a carefree childhood. They were given something else, a place, a purpose, and a love sharp enough that people who owned almost nothing gave their very best to a child who could no longer use it. But wanting a child to live and being able to keep them alive were two very different things. And the road from birth to adulthood was a gauntlet that most did not finish. Winter was the great filter, the season when the food ran thin, and the smallest bodies, fairies, the very young and the very old, were the first the cold came for. Sickness swept through crowded tents with no medicine to stop it. A fall, a broken leg far from help, a hunt that went wrong, a predator that found a child a few steps too far from the fire, any of these could end a young life in an afternoon. This is the hard arithmetic behind that number from the start, the reason only about half of all children grew up. Every adult standing in that band was a survivor of a childhood that had quietly taken many of the others, brothers and sisters and cousins who simply did not make it through a bad year. They grew up knowing loss the way we know weather, and for the ones who did make it through, adulthood arrived early, with none of the long drifting years we give a teenager now. Somewhere around 10 to 13, a child crossed over. A boy who had thrown 1,000 practice spears at tufts of grass finally stood with the men on a real hunt, close enough to a mammoth to feel the ground move, and came back either changed or not at all. A girl who had shadowed her mother and grandmother for years now carried the full knowledge of plants and ready to keep her own family healing. These crossings often came with a moment that marked them, a first kill, a ceremony, a new place at the fire, the group formally recognizing that the child was gone and an adult stood in their place. There was no waiting until you felt ready. The land did not care whether you felt ready, it only asked whether you had learned enough, and by 12 or 13, you either had, or the years of play had ended with the lessons still unfit. It would be easy to hear all of this and feel only the harshness of it. But that would miss the thing these children had that so many of ours are quietly starving for. They were never, ever alone. A child in that world grew up inside a dense, warm tangle of people. Mother and father and grandparents and aunts and a swarm of cousins. Every one of them within a few steps, every one of them holding a piece of raising you. There was no such thing as a lonely afternoon. No locked bedroom. No glowing screen standing in for a friend. There were bodies to sleep against for warmth, endless laps to climb into, older kids to trail after, and elders whose entire job, in the last part of their lives, was to sit with the young and pour a lifetime of stories and knowledge into them by the fire. For all the cold and all the danger and all the loss, these were children wrapped every waking hour in something we spend fortunes trying to buy back. The absolute, unquestioned certainty that they belonged, that they mattered, and that they were never facing the dark by themselves. And that is the real answer to what childhood was like in Ice Age America, an answer that turns the whole question inside out. We started by pitying these children for everything they didn't have. No toys, no safety, no gentle years. Just being small off. But look at what that childhood actually was, and it stops looking like deprivation and starts looking like the most important thing theirs ever did. Every game was a rehearsal. Every miniature tool was an apprenticeship. Every story by the fire was an entire library being copied, without a single written word, from one generation into the next. A child at play in that camp was not passing the time. They were the way an entire way of life survived, the living thread by which fire and language and the map of a whole continent were handed forward, uninterrupted, for hundreds of generations. These were not deprived children. They were the most carefully made human beings of their world, and the mind that a childhood like that produced. Patient, watchful, endlessly taught, endlessly loved, was the exact mind that walked into an empty frozen continent and, within a few thousand years, made all of it home. So, the next time you watch a child today, surrounded by more toys than an entire Ice Age band would see in a lifetime, and yet somehow still bored, still restless, still reaching for a screen, remember what a childhood used to be. Remember that, for almost the whole story of our species, to be a child was to be always held, always watched, always learning the one thing that mattered, always woven into a group that would never once let you feel alone. They had no toys, and they were building the people who would conquer a world. We have everything. And we are still trying to remember how they did it. So tell me, in the comments, what is one thing your childhood taught you without a single toy or screen? One skill you learned just from the people around you. Go find whoever taught it to you and thank them. And the first chapters of their story are still waiting.